I was standing near the back of the conference hall when my boss rolled his eyes and muttered just loud enough for everyone around us to hear, "Why is she even here?" A few people chuckled. Others avoided looking at me, suddenly very interested in their phones or coffee cups. My face burned, but I forced myself to stay still. Walking out would only prove his point. The annual corporate conference was a big deal. Leaders, investors, and partners from all over the country had gathered in the grand ballroom of the hotel. My boss, Mark, loved moments like this. He enjoyed being the loudest voice in the room and reminding everyone that I was just the assistant. Truth was, I had spent the last 6 months doing far more than scheduling meetings and answering emails. While Mark traveled and took credit for everything, I was the one who had coordinated the research, built the strategy report, and prepared the presentation that our company planned to unveil that afternoon. But of course, none of that had my name on it. Mark leaned toward one of the managers and smirked. "She probably got lost on the way to the coffee station." More quiet laughter. I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked toward the stage. A massive screen displayed the conference logo while people slowly took their seats. The host, a well-known industry moderator, walked out to the podium and tapped the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the highlight presentation of the conference." The room settled into silence. Mark straightened his suit jacket confidently. He whispered to the manager beside him, "Watch this. This is where we impress everyone." My hands were slightly shaking, but I kept them folded in front of me. The host continued, "Today we're introducing a strategy that has already attracted major investor interest. But before we begin, I'd like to invite the person who actually developed the framework." Mark frowned. The host glanced down at his notes, then looked up and smiled. "Please welcome the architect of the project." He paused just long enough for the entire room to focus on the stage. "Emily Carter." For a second, nobody moved. Then the host repeated it, clearer this time. "Emily Carter, could you please come up and present?" Dozens of heads turned, directly toward me. Mark's confident smile vanished. His eyes widened as the room slowly realized that the assistant he had just mocked was the one being called to the stage. The silence felt enormous. I took a calm breath, stepped forward, and walked past my boss without saying a word. As I reached the aisle, I heard someone whisper behind me, "Wait, she's the one who built the project?" By the time I reached the stage, the room had gone completely quiet, and for the first time all day, Mark didn't have a single thing to say. The host stepped aside and gestured toward the microphone. "Emily, the stage is yours." For a moment, I simply looked at the audience. Hundreds of faces. Executives, investors, journalists, competitors. All staring at me. 6 months ago, I would have frozen. But not today. I placed my laptop on the podium and connected it to the screen. The presentation I had built appeared behind me, slides Mark had been bragging about all morning, as if they were his. I glanced briefly toward the crowd. Mark was still standing where I had left him. His arms were stiff at his sides, his mouth slightly open. The manager next to him looked just as confused. I turned back to the microphone. "Good afternoon," I said calmly. "My name is Emily Carter, and over the last 6 months I've been leading the research and development of this strategy." A quiet murmur spread through the room. I continued. "What you're about to see is a framework designed to solve one of the biggest problems in our industry, inefficient market expansion." The next slide appeared. Charts, data, forecast models. Every detail I had spent late nights building while Mark was busy attending dinners and taking credit for the progress. As I explained the structure of the strategy, the room leaned in. Heads nodded. People began taking notes. About 10 minutes in, someone in the front row raised a hand. One of the investors. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you saying this model could reduce expansion costs by nearly 40%? "Yes," I replied, "based on the pilot analysis and 3 regional simulations." He slowly smiled. "That's impressive." Another investor whispered something to the person beside him. A few rows back, someone began typing quickly on a laptop. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. By the time I reached the final slide, the audience was completely silent again, but this time it wasn't awkward silence. It was attention. I closed my laptop. And that, I said, is the strategy. For half a second, nothing happened. Then someone started clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. I stepped away from the podium slightly overwhelmed, but trying to stay composed. The host walked back onto the stage, smiling. Emily, he said into the microphone, that might be one of the most practical strategies we've seen at this conference. More applause. Then he added something that made my heart skip. And I believe a few people here would like to speak with you. He gestured toward the front row. 3 investors were already standing. I looked across the room again, and my eyes landed on Mark. He wasn't smiling anymore. In fact, he looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. The manager beside him leaned closer and whispered something I couldn't hear. But I didn't need to, because for the first time since I had started working there, everyone in the room finally knew who had really done the work. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the room hadn't. The host turned to me again. We'll now open the floor for a few questions. Immediately, several hands went up. The first investor who had spoken earlier stood fully now. Emily, if your projections are accurate, this strategy could reshape expansion models across the industry. Who on your team worked with you on it? I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Across the room, Mark shifted uncomfortably. This project was developed internally over the last 6 months, I said carefully. I coordinated the research, built the models, and led the pilot analysis. The investor nodded slowly, clearly impressed. Another hand went up, this time from someone sitting next to him. A woman in a dark suit leaned toward the microphone. If your company doesn't implement this immediately, other firms will. Have they confirmed that you'll be leading the rollout? A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. I could feel dozens of eyes turning toward Mark again. I answered honestly. That decision hasn't been officially announced yet. The room went quiet. Then the woman smiled slightly and said something that made several people chuckle. Well, they should probably hurry. More laughter followed. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mark finally move. He walked quickly down the aisle toward the stage, forcing a tight smile as he approached. The host handed him a microphone. Thank you, Mark, the host said politely. Your team clearly did impressive work. Mark cleared his throat. Yes, well, he began. Our department has been working very hard on this initiative. I didn't say anything. Neither did the audience. Mark continued, trying to regain control. Emily has helped with some coordination, but this strategy has been a collaborative effort from leadership. There was a strange pause after he finished. Then the host tilted his head slightly. Interesting, he said. He glanced down at the conference program booklet in his hand. Because according to the submission documentation, the project was filed under a single author. The room grew very still. Mark's smile faded again. The host looked up. And that author is Emily Carter. A few people in the audience exchanged glances. Someone in the back actually said, "Oh wow." Mark tried to laugh it off. Well, yes, technically the paperwork. But before he could finish, one of the investors near the front interrupted. Mark, the man said calmly, if Emily built the model and presented the strategy, why isn't she the one leading the division? That question hung in the air like a spotlight. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again, because for the first time since I had started working under him, he didn't have an answer. The investor's question hung in the air. Why isn't she the one leading the division? For a moment, the only sound in the ballroom was the quiet hum of the projectors. Mark shifted his weight and forced a tight laugh. Well, leadership decisions are complex, he said. Experience, hierarchy, company structure. But he sounded less confident with every word. The investor didn't look convinced. In fact, several people in the front row were now watching him with the same expression, curiosity mixed with skepticism. The host glanced between us and then spoke carefully. Perhaps this is something the company's executive leadership should address. Almost on cue, a voice came from the center table near the stage. Actually, the voice said calmly, I think we can address it right now. Every head in the room turned. Standing slowly from his chair was Daniel Reeves, our company's CEO. Mark went completely still. The CEO adjusted his jacket and walked toward the stage with the quiet confidence of someone used to commanding attention without raising his voice. When he reached the microphone, the room was silent again. "First," Daniel said, looking at me, "Emily, that was an exceptional presentation." More applause broke out, though softer this time. "Second," he continued, turning slightly toward Mark, "I'd like to clarify something." Mark straightened nervously. Daniel held up the conference booklet. "This strategy," he said, "was brought to my attention 3 months ago. Not by Mark." He paused. "But by Emily." A ripple spread through the audience. Daniel continued calmly. "She requested a brief meeting to show me her model. I gave her 15 minutes. He smiled faintly. She used 12. A few quiet laughs moved through the room. "And by the end of those 12 minutes, he said, I asked her to prepare it for this conference." Mark's face had gone pale. Daniel turned fully toward the audience now. "The reason Emily was invited to present today is simple. She built the strategy. She understands it better than anyone in the company." He paused again. "And starting next quarter," the entire room leaned forward, "she will be leading the new strategic development division." For half a second, nobody reacted. Then the ballroom erupted. Applause, surprised voices, chairs shifting. Someone near the back even let out a whistle. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. Daniel looked at me again and gave a small nod. "You earned it." My eyes instinctively moved across the room toward Mark. He looked like he had just watched the ground collapse beneath him. The same people who had been laughing at his jokes earlier were now whispering to each other. And no one was laughing anymore. As the applause slowly faded, Daniel leaned slightly closer to the microphone and added one final sentence. "Sometimes," he said calmly, "the quietest person in the room is the one doing the most important work." The audience applauded again. And this time, they were looking directly at me. The applause took a long time to settle. People were still whispering, some turning in their seats to look at me again, this time not with curiosity, but with something closer to respect. Daniel, the CEO, stepped slightly aside and gestured for me to remain at the microphone. "Emily will be available for a few minutes after the session if anyone would like to discuss the strategy further," he said. Immediately, several hands went up again. But before the next question could start, I felt something shift behind me. Mark. He had finally walked onto the stage. Up close, he looked very different from the confident man who had mocked me earlier that morning. His shoulders were tight, and the smile he tried to force looked painfully fragile. "Emily," he said quietly, leaning closer so only I could hear him, "maybe we should talk about this later." For the first time all day, I didn't feel nervous standing next to him. I simply nodded politely. "We can talk later," I replied calmly. Then I turned back to the audience. Another investor stood to ask a question about the implementation timeline. A journalist asked if the model would be published. Someone else wanted to know if our company planned to license the framework. For the next 15 minutes, I answered every question. And every time someone spoke, they addressed me the same way. Emily. Not assistant. Not someone from Mark's team. Just my name. Eventually, the host stepped forward again and wrapped up the session. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smiling broadly, "I think we've just witnessed one of the most interesting presentations of this year's conference." More applause filled the room. As people began standing and gathering their things, several executives walked toward the stage. One investor shook my hand firmly. "Brilliant work." Another said, "If you ever decide to start your own firm, call me first." I laughed softly, still trying to process everything. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark step down from the stage. He didn't stay to speak with anyone. He just walked quietly toward the exit doors. No jokes. No smug comments. No audience anymore. Just a man leaving a room that had finally stopped believing him. Meanwhile, the host leaned closer to me with a grin. "You know," he said quietly, "when your boss asked earlier why you were here," he gestured toward the crowd of people now waiting to speak with me. "I think everyone in this room has their answer now." I looked out over the ballroom one more time. 6 months of late nights. 6 months of being overlooked. 6 months of hearing that I was just the assistant. And now the same room that had laughed earlier was waiting to hear what I would say next. Funny how quickly things change when the truth finally gets a microphone. Within minutes, a small line had formed near the stage. Investors, executives, a couple of reporters. Each conversation felt surreal. Emily, how soon can the model be implemented? Emily, have you considered international expansion? Emily, would you be open to presenting this to our board next month? Just that morning, I had been the person quietly arranging schedules for meetings like these. Now I was the one being invited to them. Eventually, the crowd thinned a little. The ballroom was starting to empty as people moved on to the next conference sessions. I was gathering my laptop when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Emily. I turned. Mark had come back. He looked different. Not angry. Not arrogant. Just uncomfortable. For a few seconds he seemed unsure what to say. Then he cleared his throat. I didn't realize the CEO had already approved the division announcement, he said. That must have been surprising. It was, I replied honestly. He nodded slowly. I suppose I should congratulate you. There was an awkward pause before he added, quieter this time. You've clearly done impressive work. 6 hours ago, hearing those words from him would have meant everything. Now, they just felt late. Still, I kept my tone polite. Thank you. He shifted again, glancing around the now half-empty ballroom. You know, he continued, we've worked together for a while. Maybe once things settle down, we can discuss how our teams will collaborate going forward. Our teams. The words hung in the air between us. Because for the first time since I'd joined the company, he wasn't my boss anymore. I gave a small, professional smile. I think the leadership team will define that structure soon. He nodded again, clearly realizing the conversation wasn't going the way he hoped. Well, good luck with everything. Then he walked away for the second time that afternoon. Only this time, no one was watching him leave. Most of the attention in the room had shifted somewhere else entirely. Toward the stage. Toward the woman who, just a few hours earlier, had been quietly standing in the back, while someone asked, "Why is she even here?" I packed my laptop into my bag and took one last look around the ballroom. The lights were dimming slightly as staff prepared the room for the evening session. The same stage, the same microphone, the same room, but somehow, it felt completely different now. Not because people had finally noticed me, but because I had finally been given the chance to speak. And once the truth was heard, it turned out the room had been ready to listen all along. That evening, after the final conference session ended, the ballroom had transformed. The large presentation screens were gone. In their place were round tables, soft lighting, and quiet music. The conference dinner had begun. Earlier that day, I would have been the one checking seating charts or confirming dietary requests. Tonight, my name was printed on one of the main tables, near the front. I stared at the card for a moment before sitting down. Emily Carter, Strategic Development. It still felt unreal. A few minutes later, Daniel, the CEO, joined the table along with 2 investors I had spoken with earlier. One of them raised his glass, slightly, when he saw me. Still processing the day? He asked with a friendly smile. A little, I admitted. Daniel chuckled softly. That's normal, he said. The first big moment usually feels like that. I looked at him. First, he nodded. You don't build something like that strategy by accident, he said. You've probably been doing impressive work for a long time. I hesitated, then smiled. I've been doing a lot of work, I said. He laughed quietly at that. Dinner continued with relaxed conversation. People talked about the market, upcoming projects, and potential partnerships. Every now and then someone would ask me another question about the strategy. But for the first time all day, it didn't feel like pressure. It just felt like opportunity. At one point, Daniel leaned slightly closer and spoke in a lower voice. I should tell you something. I looked at him. When you came to my office 3 months ago, he said, you looked almost exactly the way you did this morning, like someone who wasn't sure if anyone would listen. I laughed softly. That's accurate. But you still asked for 15 minutes, he continued. That matters. He took a sip of water and added, a lot of talented people never ask. For a moment, I thought about all the late nights, All the meetings where I had quietly taken notes while others spoke, all the times someone had said I was just the assistant. Then I looked around the dinner hall. People were laughing. Conversations were flowing. The same industry leaders who had barely noticed me this morning were now greeting me when they walked past the table. Not because anything about me had suddenly changed, but because the truth had finally been visible. As the evening began to wind down, Daniel stood up from the table. "Before everyone leaves," he said casually, "I'd like to introduce someone to a few of our partners." He looked at me. "Emily, would you join me?" I stood. Across the room, I noticed Mark sitting at a table near the back. He was speaking quietly with two managers, but when he saw Daniel gesture for me to walk with him, he paused. Just for a second. Then he looked away. I followed Daniel across the room toward a group of executives who had been waiting near the entrance. As we approached, Daniel spoke with calm certainty. "Everyone," he said, "I'd like you to meet the person leading one of our most important initiatives this year." He turned slightly toward me. "This is Emily Carter." For the second time that day, every conversation near us stopped. But this time, no one was asking why I was there.